This is Section 1, China to 1894. Our objectives for this section are to understand the traditional Chinese social and political structure, to understand how the Qing dynasty both accepted and transformed these structures, to understand the domestic and foreign pressures the Qing faced, and to understand why the Qing resisted reform. Someone could reasonably ask, why do we start this class with China? Why not Japan or Korea? Now, of course, I could just say, well, it's alphabetical order, but there's actually another reason why I want to start the class with China. And that's because of the three countries of East Asia, China is the first that's going to develop an advanced civilization, an advanced culture, a complex state and society. And Japan and Korea, as we discussed previously, are going to borrow from China. So that's a key reason why we want to start this class with China. And I use, you can see the Chinese characters up there. There's two sets. The first one is Zhongguo, reading from left to right at the top. And the other is the same. It's just the first is the simplified way of writing the characters. The second, the one on the bottom, is the traditional way of writing those characters. But in either case, they both mean the same thing. They mean China. And literally, they mean the Middle Kingdom. So China does have a central place in East Asia in terms of influencing the countries around it. And we can see this in the simple fact, and this is a kind of review, because they're the ones who developed writing that the Japanese and Koreans would eventually adopt. And with that ideas, there's ideas that will accompany that writing, such as Confucianism. So we're going to start then with China. It kind of makes sense. And this gives us kind of a clue also of how China relates not only to the rest of East Asia, but the entire world. There's this kind of understanding we are the Middle Kingdom. And they don't mean we are the Medium Kingdom. They mean we are the Central Kingdom. Now, the fact, though, that China exists as a single kingdom or a single country is itself amazing, because the thing is huge, both in terms of geography and population. And one way you can kind of think about this is that China, depending on the time period we're looking at, is about the size of Europe in terms of geography, that is area, and in terms of population. So imagine if Europe, or at least say Western and Central Europe, were ruled in the same government. Imagine if all the countries of Europe, Spain, Germany, France, Austria, Italy, imagine if all those countries were ruled by just one emperor. Now, there was a time when a large chunk of Europe was ruled by one emperor, and that would be during the Roman times. But imagine a government that had existed since ancient times up to the 19th century, right? That's not something Rome was able to do. So China was able to hold together this gigantic country about equivalent to Europe. And we really want to understand how important that was and how that shaped the Chinese system. So first of all, we just need to understand why you would think that China would just fall apart. As I said, one is size, both in terms of area and population. Another is the geographic diversity. China includes very mountainous areas, it includes subtropical areas, it includes deserts, it includes plains, it includes massive forests. It is very, very geographically diverse. And in particular, there is a north-south split. In the north, for example, northern China, that's where you're going to have more grain or wheat agriculture. And it's going to be more flat. It's going to develop a different kind of community life. In the south of China, you have a lot more rice agriculture. Like I said, there's some areas that are subtropical, and that leads to cultural differences in addition to food differences. And that could easily have led to two countries, at least, where China is, right? There could have been a northern China and a southern China. And at times in Chinese history, they broke into two. In addition, just like Europe, China is multi-ethnic. And that's one thing we have to understand, is that where Japan and Korea are mostly homogenous, I say mostly because they were not completely homogenous ethnically. They had minorities. It's just the minorities were very small and were often ignored by the majority. In China, it is a multi-ethnic empire where one ethnic group, the Han, do dominate, but they're always cognizant of the fact that there are ethnic minorities within the empire. Right, so and they consciously understood themselves in many, especially the Qing dynasty, we'll talk about later, as a multi-ethnic empire. And of course, if you have different ethnicities, you could easily break into countries centered around those ethnicities, like what you have in Europe, right, between Italians, French, Germans, and so forth. In addition, China has multiple spoken languages, and these are different languages. Someone from the south could talk to someone in the north, and they would not understand what each other were saying, right? So just like someone speaking French, someone speaking Italian, they're not really going to understand each other. You have a similar situation in China. So China has lots of reasons to have fallen apart, to become many different countries, just like what you have in Europe, but it didn't, right? Or at least I should say, it didn't for extraordinarily long periods of times. And when it did fall apart, it was always able to build itself back up together again. So then, why was it that China is able to either stay united or once it falls apart is able to reunite, whereas Europe was not able to do this? And I would argue that, first of all, one of the key things that allows the Chinese to either unite and stay united or to reunite after falling into division, and sometimes these divisions could last for hundreds of years, was the idea of China. People became convinced that they were Chinese, that there was this place called China, and that there was something wrong if that place was not unified. There couldn't be two Chinas, there should only be one, and that piece of China was connected to a particular territory, right? What Chinese would refer to as the mountains and the rivers. So where did this concept come from, though? What convinced Chinese people, or I should say the people who thought themselves as Chinese, that there was such a thing as China and that it was right for it to exist and be unified? Well, what helps make this possible, first of all, is Chinese writing. There is only one written language for China. Now, this seems kind of odd because I just said there were multiple spoken languages, but there was, in fact, one written language. And what's important for us to understand about Chinese is the meaning of a character and the way it is pronounced are completely separate. So you can pronounce characters in different ways, but they could mean the same thing. So for example, if you look on the right, there is a worksheet that our second son, John, filled out at school. I think it's kind of a funny worksheet. I am glad they want to include at his school, they want to include Chinese characters, but there is an error. Horse and vehicle should be switched around. But the major point I want us to see here is that you can see on the upper left it says sun, right? Now sun in Chinese and Mandarin Chinese is pronounced ri. In Japanese it's pronounced ni. In Korean it is pronounced il. However, it's written the exact same way. Right, it's written the exact same way. So even though those three people would pronounce it, if you had a Chinese person, Japanese, Korean person, they would all pronounce it differently. If you wrote it, they would all understand exactly what you mean. Now, we live in a society and a culture in which I think the spoken language is more important than the written a lot of the time, right? People watch a lot of TV, they listen to a lot of videos or watch a lot of videos on YouTube, they listen to music. That's where a lot of times we get our information. But in traditional time periods, before you had multimedia, before you had videos that you could just access so easily, or television or radio, the major form of transmitting ideas would be through paper, right? Pen on paper, ink on paper, through writing. So in traditional societies, right, a lot of times what holds society together is the written language, right? Not the spoken language, because people, oftentimes would not speak to each other from different parts of the country. Like, in the United States today, we could watch a program, same TV program in New York, California, South Carolina, Texas, wherever. Here, what they're sharing are typically more books, right? And this, of course, would only be only among people who were literate. So you're going to have a shared written culture, and it doesn't matter that people in different parts of China speak differently and couldn't understand each other. What is important is they can share written ideas. Now, what's being written? Well, first of all, there is a shared history that's being written. There is a Chinese history. So people come to this idea that China is important, that they should be proud of being Chinese because they've accomplished all these cool historical deeds, but also that China should be unified. And much of their history is the story of unification, and then maybe perhaps later division, and then reunification. So Chinese people have a shared history, and they all can have it no matter what language they speak, so long as they can read. And it's the people who read who, as we'll talk about later, govern China, basically. So they're the ones that are real, their sense of identity is the most important. They had this sense that China should be unified and should stay unified. There is also a shared philosophy. in this system, right? As we talked about earlier, Confucianism, this shared idea of moral norms that should be followed. We'll talk more about Confucius later on. And so you have then this concept of China. It is made possible through the shared written language that describes a shared history and a shared philosophy. So there's this idea of what we've been, what we should be, and what we should do. And this makes possible two systems that are connected to each other, the Chinese imperial system and the exam system. And these things are the actualization, the structures based around these concepts, these ideas that allow China to operate as a single unified country. So what then are the characteristics of the Chinese imperial system? Well, first of all, the Chinese emperor claimed what's called the mandate of heaven. And if you look on the right, you can see the Chinese characters for this. The top character means heaven. The bottom character means command. So it's literally the command of heaven. But it's this idea that there is a heaven, and heaven is kind of like God in a Judeo-Christian or Islamic sense, not the exact same thing, but similar in some ways, in that heaven is good. And heaven being good gives the mandate to the most moral family to rule China. And they set up the dynasty that rules China. And this is important to understand. When we talk about Chinese history, we often divide it into different dynasties, right? In this class, we'll talk briefly about the Ming dynasty and then the Qing dynasty. When a dynasty changes, the family ruling China changes. That's what it means. A different family is now ruling China. And this dynastic cycle is very important because that's how Chinese people have traditionally understood their history. But basically, there's this idea that that heaven, being good, chooses the most moral family to rule China, and they form a dynasty that will then rule China for hundreds of years, perhaps, if they're any good at it. Now, what's important is this emperor is also understood as literally the son of heaven and is the cosmic mediator between heaven and human beings on earth. Right? So this person is extraordinarily important. They have a cosmic role. The emperor will have these political and religious functions. Right? The emperor not only rules as a government official, the emperor as the mediator between heaven and earth, chosen by heaven, also has religious functions. And one thing I have to stress, there can be only one. Heaven has only one son. There was one she, by the way, Empress Wu of the Tang dynasty, but she was the exception. He in general is only one person. There can't be any other emperor at a time. Only China has the imperial office. And like I said, this office has both political and religious functions. Now, so long as the emperor performs his duties correctly, all is good, right? All is good. And remember, these are political and religious duties. And that picture on the right is a picture of the altar of heaven. And that's where the emperor would offer, either he or his deputy would offer sacrifice to heaven. And that's why that altar has no roof, right? Usually you think a temple would have like a roof or something. Well, it doesn't, because when they burn the meat and the other food sacrifices, the smoke has to float up to heaven, right? That's how the sacrifice reaches heaven. Now, if the emperor, as I said, performs his religious and political duties correctly, all is good. And the Chinese people were very practical about this. They had a very clear way of measuring this. Were they doing okay? Right? If Chinese people had enough food to eat, if they had clothes to wear, if they had places to live, and things were generally peaceful, then the emperor was doing a good job. However, if large numbers of people were lacking food, did not have places to live, and lacked clothing, that means the emperor was doing a bad job. Now, heaven being benevolent will give warnings if the emperor is not doing a good job. For example, a comet might appear suddenly in the sky. There might be an eclipse. And those things can be kind of scary. And remember, this is a time period before light pollution, when you could clearly see the stars at night. And of course, if the sun gets blotted out during the day, that's kind of freaky. Those are warnings from heaven that the emperor's not doing a good job. And if the emperor ignores those warnings from heaven, then a rebel could rise up, overthrow the emperor, and establish a new dynasty. And the Chinese thought you could only do this if heaven helped you. So if you were a successful rebel, that must mean that you were chosen by heaven. On the other one, if you were an unsuccessful one, you were just simply a traitor. But the idea here is that there is a mechanism in the Chinese imperial system to get rid of a dynasty that's doing a bad job. And that's key for us to understand. And there's always, the emperors, the dynasties are always concerned with showing that they're doing a good job, that they're maintaining harmony between heaven and earth, and you can measure how well they're doing by just making sure that people are living well, right? Are the peaceful people having enough food to eat, clothes to wear, places to live, and so forth. Now, this imperial system is closely connected to the teachings of Confucius. So who was this Confucius guy? Well, Confucius was a wandering teacher who lived a very, very, very long time ago, very ancient philosopher, 6th, 5th century BC, who was originally a government official, but became a wandering teacher during a time when China was divided and fighting amongst itself. And he was trying to figure out how to reunify China and how to get people to be good. And he saw those things as connected, right? There's this in Chinese philosophy and politics, and this is like it in many places in the world, there's this connection between national unity and stability and morality. Now, Confucius is a wandering teacher trying to bring back morality and stability to a China that was falling apart, taught that rulers could bring order, and this was understood to be for the good of the common people. Confucius believed that rulers should take care of the people. And the way that these rulers could bring order was by being moral and performing the correct rituals. And in particular, Confucius was very concerned with listening to the right kind of music. Right? So he wanted to get people to be moral, and he thought that key to doing that was performing the correct rituals, and that when people did that, you would have an orderly and stable society. And in particular, he emphasized human relationships. Right, and this is where the concept of heaven is a little bit different from the concept of God. And if you believe in God, that relationship between you and God is like the most important relationship. But and God really cares about that relationship. But heaven doesn't really care about how you relate to heaven. Heaven cares about how human beings relate to each other. So Confucius is going to emphasize human relationships, especially hierarchy. Confucius did not like equality. He thought equality was dangerous because if you and I are equal, and we have an argument, how do we resolve it? On the other hand, if one of us is the dominant one, right? If in our relationship you're the older brother or the older sister and you and I disagree, eventually you can just say, well, I'm older than you. You have to do what I say, right? So Confucius thought that in order to have harmony, we needed hierarchy. And this would be emphasized through morality and through correct rituals. So, for example, Chinese children ideally should, in the morning, and this is even when they're adults, should get up and greet their parents in the morning. This illustrates who's in charge. So there's this idea that you can bring order and stability by bringing harmony through hierarchy. And you reinforce this through good manners. A lot of these correct rituals are simply good manners. Like I said, greeting your parents in the morning to show that you respect them and you accept their authority. Now, there's a catch, though. While those below should obey, those above should treat them with benevolence. They should take care of them. And Confucius, in a sense, understood that the government should be a kind of family state. And it was not uncommon to talk about government officials as the father and mother of the people, right? The government should treat you like a child, in a sense. And this is very strange if you're American, you believe in self-government and things like that. But for a Confucian, the people should obey the government as one would obey your parents. And the government should treat the people like their children, which in one sense means telling them what to do. However, when you tell them what to do, it's supposed to be for their own good. And this system is actually going to work really, really well, right? These ideas of hierarchy, of obedience and benevolence will help hold together Chinese civilization. Like I say, you may not like them. They may be very different from your values, but the fact is this helped hold China together for almost 2,000 years. However, one thing I want to emphasize is that the teachings of Confucius focus on morality, not technical knowledge. Their primary interest is in helping people to be good, not teaching them how to build bridges or build roads or how the tax code works or anything like that. And that's going to be kind of a weak point, as we shall see as this class progresses. So having talked about the imperial system, the system based around the emperor, we now need to talk about the exam system. And like I said, it's a part of the imperial system, and it's such an important part, we need to talk about it. And Confucius is directly connected to it. So here's the problem. China is a huge place. The emperor needs people loyal to him to help him rule, because he can't possibly be everywhere at once. So he needs loyal officials to help him rule. But here's the thing. Being an official is great because it gives you lots of power, and the emperor's far away and can't always be there watching what you're doing. So it's really easy to be corrupt. So for example, I can charge higher taxes than the emperor wants, and then put the extra amount of money in my own pocket. If there's people I like, I can reward them. If there's people I don't like, I can use the law to punish them, even if they have committed no crime. So there is a problem of corruption, right? So the emperor needs loyal officials to help him rule, but the problem is everyone wants to be an official because it's an awesome job, because you can be totally corrupt and make a lot of money and reward your friends and punish your enemies. And that's really bad for the emperor. Because remember, people determine whether or not they have a good emperor or not based on whether he is able to make sure that they are well fed and enjoy peace and stability and all that stuff. So if the emperor allows a bunch of corrupt people to become officials, his dynasty will not last long. So the Chinese solution for this was to develop an exam system. They had a system of exams based on the Confucian classics, which were used to decide who could be government officials. And these were based on Confucianism. And Confucianism was all about being moral, right? Respecting authority, being benevolent to the people. And these exams were hard, and you would spend years preparing for these exams. And they taught you to think in Confucian terms. So even though, of course, there were always going to be people who were corrupt, this did help limit corruption, because by studying these materials, people internalized them and really started to believe in them, that they should be moral, that they should obey authority, and they should take care of the people under them. Now, in order to be an official, you had to actually pass 3 exams. And I think only something like 0.1% were actually ever able to pass all 3. It was very hard to pass all 3 exams. However, and this is key, you got benefits if you only passed the first one. Right. And a good amount of people could actually pass that first exam. For example, if you passed the first exam, you could not be punished physically. Right. The government was not allowed to beat you. And this is important because it was normal practice. Like if there was a court case, even if it was just like a property dispute, the government would interrogate people by beating them. But if you passed an exam, you were exempt from being beaten. You were exempt from certain taxes. So for example, you didn't have to do the labor tax. Like Chinese men were expected to do a certain amount of work for free for the government each year. But if you passed the exam, you didn't have to do that. And you can think about it this way. Imagine if you could take an exam, and if you passed it, you wouldn't have to pay sales tax for the rest of your life. That would be pretty awesome. Everyone would want to take that exam. And also exam takers or exam passers, even if you just passed that first exam, you were allowed to wear special robes that told everyone that you were a person of learning and power and status, and they should respect you. And one thing, and students often ask this, so I want to stress also, there was no punishment for failing the exams. So it made a lot of sense if you thought you had any chance of passing these exams to study for them and to try and pass them, right? There's no punishment for failing, and you get rewarded a lot if you do pass. And one thing I have to emphasize, I think is fascinating about the exams, is they did allow for certain social mobility. Theoretically, anyone could take these exams, or I should say any male. There were a few excluded cases like Buddhist priests and things like that, but basically any male could take these. There were a few cases of peasants actually taking and passing the exams, but what was more common was over several generations you could actually have upward social mobility. So you'd have some hardworking peasants, and they would work really hard and buy land to get wealthy, and their kids would become merchants, and the merchants would get really wealthy, and they would pay for their kids to have special tutors and go to special schools so they could pass the exams. So while it was hard for an individual to go from being a peasant to a government official over in his or her own lifetime, it was possible over several generations for a peasant family to become government officials. And this is very important to understand, is that the rulers, the people who actually governed China, this was not a closed group of people, right? It was possible to become, through studying these exams, to actually become a government official yourself. It may take, or for your children or grandchildren to do this. And this allowance for social mobility is going to help encourage stability in China. You don't have to overthrow the government if you want to have power in China. You just need to pass the exams. So what then does this exam system do for China? Well, first of all, it's going to spread Confucian morality throughout China. This is one reason, remember I said how China is able to hold together because there's a concept, an idea of China? Well, this is what helps make that concept. Right? There's this idea that through studying Chinese history, through studying Confucianism, through accepting this morality, that all Chinese people share something and that China should exist and it's cosmically right for it to exist. And this has direct political repercussions because all these Confucian morality encourages people to be loyal to the Chinese emperor. In addition, as China expands, it will integrate people into the empire. Anyone can take it, right? Pretty much, and I should be careful. It's not absolutely anyone. You have to be a man, and there are some men who are excluded, but like over 99% or over 95% or so of men can take it. And so rather than trying to rebel, rather than trying to overthrow the government, and you'll probably lose, it just makes a lot more sense to actually just try and study and pass the exam. In addition, it provides Chinese people with a sense of Chinese identity and connects it with being moral. That is, there is this thing called civilization, and we Chinese people should behave ourselves as part of the civilization and behave ourselves particularly in ways that will help our civilization continue to exist. All these things are really good in terms of social stability and building a system that will bring peace and harmony to large numbers of people. However, there is one problem that's going to hurt things later on. Remember, Confucianism emphasizes morality over technical knowledge. Right? They always emphasize generalists over specialists. And they tend to focus on the past and tradition rather than thinking of progress, thinking of the future. So how then did China understand itself in connection to the rest of the world? Well, first of all, and we call this the kind of Sinocentric world order. Sino is, I believe, an old Greek word meaning referring to China. And so if you see the word Sino, it means it's talking about China. Like later on, we'll talk about the first and second Sino-Japanese wars. That means the Chinese-Japanese wars. In the Sinocentric world order, China is seen not only as the center of the world, remember it's the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo in Chinese, it is also the center of the universe, like literally. So in a sense, China has a cosmic role. And Chinese culture is conflated with civilization and with morality. There is, in this worldview, and this isn't just China, but many civilizations, there's not this sense of civilizations, that there's plural. There is civilization, and that's us, and there's barbarism, and that's people who aren't like us. Now, that doesn't mean Chinese people didn't see other people as civilized. They saw Koreans as civilized because Koreans had adopted Confucian civilization. So, but for the Chinese, they saw themselves as a special place, as the center of the world, the center of the universe. They saw themselves as having a culture that was equivalent to civilization and morality. And also, and this is key to understand, no one is therefore equal to China. There is only one emperor from the Chinese perspective. The best you could do if you weren't be an emperor was to be a king. So Korea, until the late 19th century, will always only be kings. They will not be emperors. And China will expect other people to accept China because it is so great and so cosmically right as it's their overlord. And they should offer tribute to China. What's tribute? It's a gift you give to someone who is above you to show that you recognize them as being above you. So, for example, whenever I go to Korea, I always visit my old advisor there and I give him a bottle of alcohol. And that, in a sense, is tribute because I'm recognizing that he, as my advisor, had taken good care of me, and so I should offer him a gift. Now, of course, I expect him to be benevolent in return, and he is. But China expects other countries to accept it this unequal relationship, that China is their overlord and they should offer China tribute. Now, sometimes this is real. Sometimes this is just an excuse for trade. So sometimes, they'll let countries in who will, will be people from made up countries who will come to China and say, yeah, I'm from this country way over here. I bring you tribute. Can I have some gifts? And this is basically just trade, right? But the key thing is, even when it's kind of fake, there's still this idea that China is above everyone else, that no one can be equal to China. And Korea will basically accept this relationship, and we'll talk more about why Korea does when we talk about that section. And the Koreans will have a king, not an emperor. Japan is a little bit more tricky. Japan will happily borrow from China, but as we'll talk about later, it will actually claim to have its own emperor equal to the Chinese emperor.